No one saw it coming. The federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan had weathered weeks of dramatic testimony, exhibits flashed on monitors, whispered objections between attorneys, and the occasional gasp from the gallery. But nothing prepared anyone for the moment when the prosecutor calmly announced, "The United States calls Janice Diddy to the stand." For the first time since the proceedings began, absolute silence overtook the room. Reporters dropped their pens. Defense attorneys froze. Even the usually unreadable judge tilted his head slightly, curiosity replacing his habitual sternness. And at the defense table, Sean Diddy, the man once known as the architect of modern hip-hop's commercial empire, the master of celebrity illusion, went pale. His attorneys leaned toward him in panic, whispering furiously, but he didn't react. He sat motionless, lips parted slightly, eyes locked on the back of the courtroom as a bailiff escorted his mother down the aisle. Janice Diddy moved slowly, not from weakness, but from the deliberate poise of a woman who had learned how to carry pain. At 83, she still had the posture of a teacher and the steady gaze of someone who had looked disappointment in the eye before and survived it. Her silver hair was pulled back into a modest bun, her dark navy dress plain but immaculate. She didn't acknowledge the crowd or the media. She didn't glance at her son. When she reached the stand, she placed one hand on the railing, the other lifted with measured calm as she was sworn in. Her voice, though aged, was firm as she said, "I do." The judge leaned back slightly, watching her with the same caution one might give to a ticking clock you didn't realize was wired to explode. The prosecutor stepped forward gently, almost reverently, as if recognizing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. "Mrs. Diddy," he began, "we understand this is difficult. Thank you for being here today." Janice nodded once, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "Can you please tell the court," the prosecutor continued, "why you agreed to testify?" Her voice didn't tremble. "Because I believe in truth, and because I am his mother." The last few words hung in the air like incense, fragrant and heavy. In the gallery, someone stifled a sob. Diddy shifted slightly in his chair, blinking slowly, his jaw tightening. "How would you describe your relationship with your son over the years?" the prosecutor asked. Janice took a breath, steadying herself. "I raised Sean alone after his father was killed. He was 5. I worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. I believed in his dreams before he could articulate them. I celebrated his wins. I forgave his mistakes. I stood by him when the press called him arrogant, and when his rivals called him dangerous. But I did not raise him to become the man I watched on that security footage." A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by the gavel. The footage she referred to grainy hotel hallway video showing Diddy shoving a woman later, identified as Cassie Valentine, had gone viral just weeks before the trial. It had been devastating. But hearing his mother refer to it, not as a distant critic but as someone who had once kissed his forehead goodnight, carried a weight no pundit could mimic. The prosecutor carefully guided her through the early days. What was Sean like as a child? She smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through the storm. Charismatic. He had a gift. He could charm anyone. He was smart and stubborn and always wanted to be somebody. And I wanted that for him. "When did you begin to notice changes?" "It wasn't one day, it was years. Fame came quickly. So did the entourage, the mansions, the control. At first I thought it was just him learning how to be a boss. But then I noticed how people around him started walking on eggshells. Staff were afraid of him. Young women at his parties didn't look happy. Some of them looked confused, drunk, scared. She paused, eyes moist but unblinking. One time in 2008, I showed up to his Miami house unannounced. There'd been a party the night before. The cleanup crew was more like a trauma team. One girl was crying. A security guard escorted her out without shoes on. When Sean saw me, he was livid. Not embarrassed, angry, because I hadn't called first. He said I didn't understand the industry. I told him I understood what fear looked like. Diddy now sat motionless, jaw set, staring into nothing. His attorneys scribbled notes, but their faces betrayed an anxiety they hadn't shown before. The courtroom had become church-like. No one dared interrupt the sacred unraveling. "Did you speak to your son about these concerns?" "Yes," Janice said, "many times. He always dismissed them, said I was being naive, that girls knew what they were signing up for, that everyone wanted something." The prosecutor approached with a photo. "Mrs. Diddy, do you recognize this?" She studied it briefly. "That's the pool house in Los Angeles. He called it a studio. No one was allowed in, not even me. That was the first time I felt like my own son was hiding something from me." "Did you ever hear him discuss the allegations publicly made against him in 2017? "Yes, I called him. He said they were liars, that it was just the price of being powerful." "Did you believe him?" "I wanted to. He's my son." Her voice broke slightly. "But wanting something doesn't make it true. What changed your mind?" In late 2023, Cassie filed her lawsuit. I confronted him, alone, in his penthouse. I told him I needed to know not what his lawyers said, but what he really thought. He said something I'll never forget. She turned slightly toward the jury. He said, "Mom, you don't build an empire by playing by everyone else's rules. Sometimes people get hurt. That's business." Gasps erupted, quickly hushed. The judge gave a brief warning. "I didn't raise him for that," she said. "I raised him to be better than that." "Did he ever admit wrongdoing to you directly?" the prosecutor asked. "Not in so many words, but enough. He told me that once people entered his world, the rules changed. That people said yes because they wanted what he had. And if they later regretted it, well, that was on them. He said he had NDAs, payoffs, leverage. He called it leverage." She lifted her eyes to the judge. "I call it manipulation." The prosecutor placed a document on the screen. "Do you recognize this?" "Yes," she said softly. "These are my notes. I started writing down what I'd seen and heard. I was afraid I was losing my objectivity, that my love was clouding my judgment. I needed to see clearly." "And what did you see?" "A pattern, a consistent use of power to silence, to exploit, to control." "Did you confront him after seeing the assault video?" "Immediately. I said, 'How could you?' He said, 'That's not who I am anymore.' But I'd seen glimpses of that man before, the rage, the entitlement. That wasn't new. That was him." The courtroom seemed to fold inward, collapsing into the weight of her words. Even the court sketch artist paused, pencil hovering above the paper. "Why are you here today, Mrs. Diddy?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. "Because truth matters. Because my son is not above it. And because silence has protected him for too long. I love my son, but I will not lie for him. That is not love. That is complicity." She turned slowly, looked at her son for the first time. He looked up too. Their eyes met. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The empire he had built couldn't shield him from the look in his mother's eyes, and the truth in that silence said more than any verdict ever could. The next morning, the courthouse was flooded before sunrise. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk. Victims huddled in coats outside the barricades, and curious onlookers queued for public seating like they were waiting for front-row tickets to the fall of an empire. No one could deny it anymore. The testimony of Janice Diddycombe had shifted the entire gravitational pull of the trial. Even the marble columns of the courthouse looked heavier. Inside, the air buzzed with a kind of restless expectation, and when the judge took the bench, his expression gave away the gravity of what was to come. Before anyone else could speak, the lead defense attorney rose slowly and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, "we respectfully request permission for the defendant, Mr. Sean Diddycombe, to address the court directly." Audible gasps followed. The prosecution stood immediately, objecting. "If Mr. Diddycombe wishes to testify, he must do so under oath, subject to cross-examination like every other witness." The judge nodded. "Agreed. Mr. Diddycombe, do you understand the implications of taking the stand?" Diddycombe stood. The swagger was gone. No designer sunglasses, no tailored swagger in his steps. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie. His eyes were dark-circled, and he looked 10 years older than he had the day before. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. I'd like to testify." A few attorneys closed their laptops. Reporters put their pens to paper before the first word even left his mouth. He walked to the stand slowly, deliberately, like a man carrying the weight of every denied truth he had ever uttered. He raised his right hand, was sworn in, and sat. The room seemed to shrink around him. The defense attorney began. "Mr. Diddycombe, why are you choosing to testify today?" He looked toward the gallery where his mother had sat the day before. The seat was now empty. "Because I listened to my mother yesterday," he said. "I really listened. And I realized something. I've been lying to myself for years, and worse, I've been asking others to lie for me." The words landed with a quiet thud. The room didn't move. "I used to think I was the exception," he continued, voice calm but steady. "That because I came from struggle, because I built something no one thought possible. I was entitled to whatever I wanted. And when people pushed back, I told myself they didn't get it, that they didn't understand power. But the truth is, I stopped seeing people as people. I saw them as problems or pieces, nothing else." His lawyer blinked, visibly unprepared for this level of self-destruction. "Can you elaborate on the allegations against you?" "Yes," he said without flinching. "The racketeering, the coercion, the sex trafficking. I built a system where silence was bought, fear was cultivated, and consequences were manipulated. I called it leverage. I told myself if someone signed a deal, it meant they were okay with everything. But that's not how real consent works. That's not how dignity works." He looked at the jury now, eyes hollow but honest. "I made people believe that if they didn't comply, they'd lose everything. Their jobs, their safety, their names. And they did." The prosecutor stood. "With the court's permission?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." The prosecutor walked slowly, her tone calm but sharp. "Mr. Diddycombe, are you aware that what you've described qualifies under the legal definition of the crimes you've been charged with?" "Yes," he said. "I've had a lot of time to read and reflect. I understand now." And yet you originally pled not guilty to all charges. What changed? He inhaled deeply. Hearing my mother speak, she stripped away every excuse I had left, and I couldn't hide behind them anymore. Because if she could stand there and speak the truth about me, then I could sit here and do the same. Did you coerce people into sexual activity in exchange for career advancement, silence, or protection? Yes, he said, quietly but clearly, sometimes directly, sometimes through implication, but I created the environment where that coercion existed. The courtroom was absolutely still. Even the court officers seemed frozen in place. Did you use NDAs and payments to suppress allegations of abuse? Yes. Did you maintain rooms in your property specifically for the purpose of isolating, recording, or controlling individuals under the guise of professional interactions? Yes. Were drugs used in these environments? Yes, often. Did you or your staff threaten individuals who attempted to leave, speak out, or report your actions? He didn't blink. Yes. The questions continued for nearly 40 minutes, and each time he confirmed the prosecution's worst accusations, sometimes with added detail, sometimes with pain in his voice, but never with denial. His attorneys sat in silence, hands folded, staring at their notes like they could disappear into them. When the prosecutor finished, the room exhaled. Attention had broken, but it was replaced by something heavier. Not drama, not spectacle, but consequence. Diddy stepped down from the stand, hands slightly shaken. As he passed the defense table, he paused, looked briefly toward the exit where his mother had once stood, and then sat again. The judge ordered a recess. But no one left their seats, not immediately. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process the sound of the mask finally hitting the floor. 30 minutes later, the defense requested a private meeting with the prosecution and the judge. When they returned, the judge's expression had changed. He looked at Diddy, then at the jury, and said, "The court has been informed that the defendant wishes to change his plea." Murmurs shot through the room like static. "Mr. Diddy, do you confirm that you wish to plead guilty to the charges against you, knowingly and voluntarily?" Diddy stood. "Yes, Your Honor, no one forced me. I accept full responsibility for my actions." The gavel came down once, not in punishment, but finality. The plea was accepted. The jury was released. Reporters flooded the sidewalks. Headlines exploded within minutes. But inside the courtroom, Janice Diddy reappeared silently, seated once again in the front row, her eyes filled with sorrow but also a glimmer of peace. She looked at her son as he was taken into custody, and he looked back. They said nothing. But for the first time, they understood each other, not as myth and mother, but as a man and the woman who had taught him what truth really meant. And even now, at the end of everything he had built, it was that truth, quiet, unpolished, and raw, that remained. The day after the courtroom fell silent, the world exploded. News outlets across continents ran the headline in every language: "Diddy pleads guilty." On morning television, anchors blinked in disbelief as they replayed courtroom footage, breaking down every sentence, every inflection, every moment he looked at his mother. Social media turned into a storm of grief, outrage, vindication, and collective reckoning. The confession wasn't just a legal bombshell, it was cultural detonation. Because it wasn't just about one man, it was about what he represented: the power, the access, the silence, and, for many, the complicity. Within 24 hours, at least 6 major brands pulled archived campaigns that featured his music. 2 canceled future licensing deals. 3 labels announced immediate reviews of contracts and internal conduct policies. Artists who had once shared the stage with him released carefully worded statements, balancing condolences to victims with confusion, regret, and in some cases, quiet admission that they had heard the rumors but never thought they'd see the truth laid bare in sworn testimony. But for the women whose lives had been torn apart behind velvet ropes and studio walls, the noise outside meant little. For them, the reckoning was personal. For some, it meant revisiting rooms they had spent years trying to forget. For others, it meant the first night of real sleep in decades. One by one, former dancers, assistants, interns, even makeup artists began to speak up. Not with scripted press releases, but raw recollections posted in private forums and reshared across platforms. One wrote, "He made me feel like I didn't exist unless he needed something. And when I stopped being useful, I stopped being safe." Another, "I was 19. I said yes because no didn't feel like an option." And the pain didn't stop with the victims. Inside the industry, the fallout was swift. Executives at his media company resigned. Former collaborators deleted tracks. Film producers paused post-production on documentaries and biopics linked to his legacy. There was a public hunger not just for accountability, but for answers. How had this gone on for so long? Who had helped? Who had looked the other way? A now viral video from 2004 resurfaced, showing a talk show host joking about the parties no one talks about. The laughter that once made it entertaining now sounded like a warning bell ignored. And at the center of it all stood the one woman who had made the silence impossible to sustain. Janice Diddy, who had not given any interviews, was now referred to in headlines as the mother who broke the machine. Analysts dissected her courtroom testimony on primetime segments. Psychologists on morning panels explained how parental truth-telling in abuse cases often marked the beginning of real justice. But Janice remained quiet. She had said what she needed to say. And she knew the world didn't need another statement. It needed to look in the mirror. For Sean Diddy, his incarceration began not with metal bars but with psychological collapse. Gone was the entourage. Gone were the stylists, the advisors, the PR teams trained to sanitize. In their place was a prison-issued uniform and the echo of his mother's words, "I love my son, but I will not lie for him." At first, he refused visitation. Then, one week in, he accepted a visit from his eldest son, who sat across the thick glass and asked only one question. "Is it true?" Sean couldn't speak. The shame was a boulder on his chest. His son waited, then quietly placed his palm against the glass. Sean mirrored the gesture. No words passed, but something shifted. In private calls with his legal team, Sean began asking different questions, not about sentencing guidelines or appeal strategies, but about accountability, about restitution, about what it meant to rebuild something that could never be restored. One attorney, later interviewed anonymously, said, "He's broken, but he's finally honest." Back in the public sphere, the music industry wrestled with its own ghosts. Anonymous sources whispered about other power figures, contracts signed under pressure, young women disappearing from projects without explanation. What began as a courtroom confession became an industry autopsy, and yet amid the reckoning, something else began to grow. Not forgiveness, not yet, but clarity, cultural clarity. The idea that brilliance does not excuse brutality. that legacy cannot be built on the bones of the silenced, and that justice, however delayed, still holds the power to disrupt even the most carefully constructed myths. At a women's shelter in Brooklyn, a framed newspaper clipping of Janice Diddy testimony now hangs near the intake desk. Underneath it, a handwritten note reads, "Truth is love, and love tells the truth." 6 weeks later, as the sentencing date approached, courtroom sketches replaced glossy album covers on billboards. Commentators no longer asked, "Did he do it?" but instead debated what length of prison term was enough to match the weight of harm caused. Victims would be allowed to read impact statements, and the world would once again return to the same courtroom. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but for closure. As the date neared, the question no longer centered on what Sean Diddy had done. That was clear. The question now was what the rest of the world would do next. The sentencing hearing began just after 9 a.m., but the line to get inside had wrapped around the block since dawn. News vans idled along the curbs, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while photographers jockeyed for position to catch even a glimpse of the man once considered untouchable. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different than before, less electric, more solemn, like a family funeral where no one was sure who to mourn. Sean Diddy sat at the defense table, dressed in the same dark suit he had worn during his guilty plea. No tie, no smirk, no armor, only the weight of a week's lived without denial. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken, but his back remained straight, not defiant, just resolved. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled. Victims flanked the front rows, some holding hands, others clutching folded letters. Court officers stood along the perimeter like sentinels of a story that had gone far beyond legal proceedings. Janice Diddy sat once again in the front row, her hands clasped gently in her lap. She hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't given any interviews, but her presence alone had become a symbol of something bigger than family. It had become a quiet, unshakable reminder that truth sometimes comes from the closest place and hits the hardest. The judge entered. Silence fell like a curtain. He looked at the room, then at the man before him, and nodded for the hearing to begin. One by one, the victims approached the lectern. Some had testified during trial. Others had stayed silent until this moment. The first, a former dancer named Kiara, unfolded a handwritten note and looked Diddy in the eye. "I was 17 when I met you," she said, her voice shaken but fierce. "You promised opportunity. You delivered silence and shame. And I carried that shame for 15 years. Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "I don't need you to understand what you did. I need the world to never forget it." The next, a woman named Elena, had worked as a junior project manager in his media firm. "I said yes to meetings I didn't want. I smiled in photos I didn't believe in. I laughed at jokes that made my skin crawl. You taught me how to shrink myself to survive in a world that worshipped you." A third, voice trembling, said, "I believed your charisma meant safety, that your fame meant legitimacy. I was wrong." Each voice added a thread to the tapestry of harm. Each voice pierced deeper than the last. Some cried, some stared with unflinching rage. All spoke truths no verdict could undo. When they were finished, the judge nodded toward the defense table. "Mr. Diddy would you like to address the court?" The room froze again. Slowly, Diddy stood. He walked to the lectern with a silence that said more than footsteps. He placed both hands on the wood and looked out not at the judge, not at his attorneys, but at the people he had harmed. "There's nothing I can say that erases what I did," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "There's no apology big enough. But I need to speak, not for mercy, for truth." He paused, then turned slightly to his left, eyes locking with Janice. "To my mother, thank you for doing what I couldn't, for speaking the truth when I still clung to lies. You raised me better than what I became. I failed you, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Janice did not nod. She did not cry. She simply listened, a statue of strength. He turned back to the gallery. "To the women I hurt, exploited, silenced, manipulated your words, cut me open, and they should. I did things that can't be undone. I used power as a shield and a weapon. I convinced myself that success justified the destruction I left behind. I called it business. I called it lifestyle. But it was abuse. It was me choosing to be more than others and treating them as less." His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I don't ask you to forgive me. I ask you to know that I hear you. I believe you. And I will carry what I did for the rest of my life." He stepped back, sat down. No theatrics, no tears, just words that hung in the air like ash. The judge took a long breath, then began to speak. His voice was firm, but not cold. "Mr. Diddy, you built an empire on the backs of people who were too afraid to say no. You created a system that rewarded silence and punished resistance. You corrupted power into coercion. And now the weight of that empire rests on your shoulders. This court does not sentence you only for the crimes listed in your plea. It sentences you for the pattern you created, the lives you altered, and the culture you poisoned." He paused. "You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck once, a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. Some in the gallery wept. Others simply stared, trying to absorb the finality. As court officers approached to escort Diddy away, he turned one last time to look at his mother. She looked back. Their eyes met. No tears, no nods, just the quiet understanding that this was the end of one story and the fragile beginning of another. He turned, was led away. The doors closed behind him. Outside, the cameras clicked furiously. But inside, Janice Diddycombe stood slowly, walked toward the exit with the grace of a woman who had never asked for a stage, but had become the center of a nation's moral reckoning. A reporter called out, "Ms. Diddycombe, do you have anything to say now that it's over?" She paused, turned, and said, "It's not over, but it's finally honest." Then she walked into the sunlight, not as the mother of a fallen icon, but as the woman who taught the world that love, real love, tells the truth, even when it shatters everything.